So that makes me wonder two things. Number one, will you ever write a historical romance set in medieval England? And number two, will you ever write a romance that is really pulling from the conventions of medieval romance?
I will say yes. I hope to do both of those things. There's so many medieval romances that I would love to work into modern retelling, the way people like to go back to Beauty and the Beast or those fairy tales.
Yeah.
There's just so much material out there that I think because it's bizarre and because it's inaccessible, that's been holding me back. I really would love to write a romance based on Melusine, but how do I deal with the fact that she turns into a fairy? She's a snake from the waist down 1 day a week, you can't escape it. Her husband finds her in her bath, and there she is splashing her big long tail. It's a really pivotal moment in the book. So once I figure out how to make those bizarre moments, metaphors that will translate, then absolutely yes. The thing that's holding me back from medieval fiction is that I've spent too much time in the history and I'm too
Mm,
worried about changing anything. In the Georgian period, I'm like, we'll just miff this a little bit. I feel freer to
yeah.
change that, even though, I've taught it, I've studied it, and the rest of it. But the medievalists, I feel like my medievalist friends are on my shoulder, like, no, that it's more important to get the history right if I'm writing historical romance in the medieval period. But eventually I'll reach a point where I'll be able to kind of distance
Yeah.
myself. So,
Well, I think,
no.
we've got orc romances, we've got vampires and werewolves. I think you can bring in a fairy snake.
Why can't you have a fairy snake? Where are all the fairy snake women, anyways?
And so I'm also curious about your experience being a, scholar in the literary world and then also having this love of romance. I think there's a stereotype that I have that there's kind of snobbishness around romance.
Yes.
So have you been on a journey about that? Or you said you've been writing romance forever. So have you just kind of let that fall, go off your shoulders?
That was a struggle for a long time. So when I entered MFA workshops, I hid the romance writer part of me very
Mm-hmm.
deep down. I hid the little girl who read a lot of Harlequin romances. It was okay to say I fell in love with Jane Eyre because that was literature. I could study Jane Eyre. But the reason I was drawn to medieval romance, which by the way was demeaned in its own time. People were like, oh, and then they read a romance and that's going to ruin their minds. There's an echo of that in the print culture of the 18th century. All those
Mm,
stereotypes about those maids who are reading by the fire and getting ideas. And then they'll just be hysterical or you can't reason with them. There's that idea that indulging in fantasy destroys your ability for logic. That's just
mm,
fundamental to a lot of assumptions that are made about literature, about women, about people, about the world. And after a while, studying the medieval romance, dealing with what the monks had said about it and the scholars had said about it, and then reading and teaching inside of the early modern period and then the 18th century and seeing what people had said about the prose novel, I just claimed it. I'm like, I love this. I want to write romance. It turned out I had a really tough journey to figure out the structure of a novel, having been trained in the short story. So
mm-hmm.
that was a different thing to tackle. But I was getting my MFA at Cornell University at the same time as I was doing my PhD. So I would
Oh,
start
wow.
floating the idea like, what if I wrote a fantasy? What if I wrote a romance? And just, I just started laying those little seeds. So I don't think anybody from my MFA cohort was terribly surprised when I came out. And then it was a few years later after the degree published a romance. They probably said, we knew it all along. We saw this coming. So now I just own it and I will still, I'll give my book as a gift and someone in their family will say, "Oh, that's, a smut book." And I'm like, "Yes, it is. Why is fantasy bad? Explain to me why it's wrong to escape
Yeah.
into a book."
Right. And why, if there's some sexiness in a romance, it's labeled smut. But then John Updike in the
It's literature.
the witches of Eastwick, they're like having threesomes, and it's like, let's study this.
Yes, I think the thing that dismisses romance is the happy ending. Honestly, I don't even think it's the sex. I think it's the happy ending because it's unrealistic. So I think that's why it still gets degraded. Those things go hand in hand. It's indulging the passions of women, it's exploring women's sexuality. There's always something really dangerous about that, even in our day and age, I would argue. But happy ending, Inferior, not real
Yes.
life. So,
Yes.
fantasy. That's my
Yeah.
theory. Just floating it out there.